Michael always believed he had a stable family life. At 46, he'd been married to Clara, his devoted but busy wife. For over 2 decades, they had 2 children, Lena, their outgoing and sociable daughter, who was away at college, and Lucas, their 20-year-old youngest son, who still lived at home while attending university nearby. Lucas had always been a quiet child, preferring books and technology to social gatherings. Michael had always chalked it up to Lucas simply being an introvert. Nothing to worry about. Lately, however, Michael had noticed subtle changes in his son. Lucas had become more withdrawn, participating less in family dinners and avoiding prolonged conversations. Sometimes, his eyes held an indescribable sadness, as if something heavy was weighing him down. Michael sensed this shift, but he didn't want to pressure his son to open up if he wasn't ready. The opportunity to understand Lucas came when Clara had to go away on a business trip for a week, leaving the 2 men alone at home. The first day was unremarkable. They still had dinner together, but the atmosphere was somewhat subdued. Michael tried to make conversation about school and Lucas's projects, but his son only gave short answers. Although he didn't want to admit it, Michael felt an invisible barrier between them, a barrier he didn't know how to overcome. The first night after Clara left, Michael felt everything in the house was quieter than usual. He went to bed as usual, but in the middle of the night, a soft sound startled him awake. The squeak of the bedroom door hinge in the silent darkness. At first, Michael thought it might be the wind or some random noise in the house. But when he opened his eyes, he saw Lucas's familiar silhouette standing in the doorway. Michael frowned, his voice still groggy with sleep. "Lucas? Why are you up so late?" Lucas paused for a moment, as if considering whether to answer. Then he said softly, "I just wanted to check on you, Dad." That answer surprised Michael. Lucas had never had a habit of doing this. Sensing that something was wrong but not wanting to create pressure, he just nodded and said, "I'm fine, son. Can't you sleep?" Lucas lowered his head slightly, avoiding his father's gaze. "Yeah, I guess not." Michael patted the chair near the window. "You can sit here for a while, if you want." Lucas hesitated, but then he stepped in and sat down. He didn't say anything, just looked out the window with a faraway look in his eyes. In the dimly lit, moonlit room, Michael could see his son's hands unconsciously intertwining, as if he were trying to restrain some emotion. Not wanting to pressure him to speak, Michael just remained silent, giving him his space. After a while, Lucas stood up and said softly, "I'm going to bed. Good night, Dad." Michael watched him leave the room, his heart filled with a vague worry. Something was troubling his son. But what? He couldn't figure it out. The nights that followed a strange cycle. Michael thought that the incident that night was just a momentary thing. But it wasn't. The next night, he was awakened again by the sound of the door opening. Once again, Lucas appeared in the doorway, as silent as the night before. "Can't you sleep again?" Michael asked, this time more awake. Lucas just nodded. This time, he didn't sit down, but just stood there for a moment, then quietly turned away. Michael began to worry for real. This was no longer a coincidence. This boy was enduring something. But what? He couldn't guess. By the third night, when Lucas was standing in his bedroom doorway again, Michael decided to be more proactive. He sat up and said, "Lucas, do you want to talk to me?" Lucas hesitated. He clasped his hands together, as if in an internal struggle. Finally, he shook his head. "Not now." Michael sighed, but kept his voice gentle. "Okay. But if you want to, I'm always ready to listen." Lucas looked at his father for a moment, his eyes full of conflict and deliberation. Then he said softly, "Thanks, Dad." Those were just simple words, but they made Michael feel that there was something very deep behind them. The next day, when Michael tried to make conversation at breakfast, Lucas returned to his usual silence. Even so, Michael knew that his son needed something, perhaps understanding, perhaps comfort, and he was determined not to leave Lucas alone with unspoken feelings. Michael had always prided himself on being a father who understood his children. But now, seeing Lucas withdraw more and more, he realized that he probably didn't understand his son as much as he thought. From those strange nights on, Michael watched Lucas more closely. His son was no longer just a quiet guy now. He was carrying an invisible sadness, some burden he couldn't or wouldn't share. Lucas rarely left his room. His meals were usually quick and then he'd leave. his eyes avoiding any contact with his father. Michael could clearly feel an invisible barrier between the two, something that hadn't been there before. That evening, as Lucas was about to quietly leave the dinner table as usual, Michael decided he couldn't continue to ignore it. "Lucas," he called his son by name in a calm but firm voice. Lucas stopped. He didn't look his father in the eye. But he didn't leave either. "Can you stay a little longer?" Michael asked, trying to keep his voice as gentle as possible. Lucas remained silent for a moment, then reluctantly sat down, his hands clenched together, a habit Michael had gradually recognized whenever his son was stressed. "What's going on with you?" Michael asked, his eyes full of sincere concern. "I don't want to pressure you, but I can't ignore it when I see you drifting away like this." Lucas bit his lip, his eyes filled with hesitation. Then, after a long, seemingly endless silence, he said softly, "I feel like I'm always alone. Even when there are people around, I still feel empty, like I'm invisible." Those words made Michael's heart ache. He had always thought that Lucas was just a quiet person, that he liked his privacy. But it turned out that even in this house, his son had always felt alone. "Lucas," Michael gently called his son's name, feeling guilty wash over him. "I'm sorry if I didn't realize it sooner." Lucas shook his head, smiling slightly, but the smile contained more tiredness than joy. "It's not your fault. It's just, I don't know how to explain it. No one did anything wrong. But I still feel that way." Michael felt a pang of pain in his heart as he heard his son say that. He wanted to say something, to tell Lucas that he wasn't alone, that he was always there. But he was afraid that empty words of comfort wouldn't help. Instead, he reached out, placing his hand gently on Lucas's clenched hand. "You're not invisible, Lucas," he said, his voice warm and certain. "I see you. I always see you." Lucas looked up at his father, his eyes shining with an emotion Michael couldn't describe, a mixture of skepticism, pain, and a hint of fragile hope. "Thanks, Dad," he said, his voice so small it was almost a whisper. Michael squeezed his son's hand lightly, as a confirmation that he would always be there, that he would never leave Lucas alone again. That night, Michael tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Lucas's words echoed in his mind, making him understand that maybe this boy had been struggling with his emotions for a long time. And he promised himself that no matter what happened, he would not let his son suffer alone for another day. That night, as Michael was just falling asleep, the familiar sound of the bedroom door opening again woke him up. Without looking, he knew who was standing there. He took a deep breath before speaking, his voice low but without reproach. "Is that you again, Lucas?" Lucas stood silently in the doorway, the faint light from the hallway shining on his face, highlighting his troubled eyes. He didn't answer immediately, but just looked down at the floor, as if trying to gather the courage to enter. Michael sat up, patting the empty part of the bed next to him. "Come on, you can sit down if you want." Lucas hesitated a moment, but finally approached and sat down on the edge of the bed. The atmosphere in the room became subdued, with only the soft breathing of the two of them. Michael could feel his son's tension through every small movement, his hands clenching the hem of his pajamas. His shoulders slightly hunched as if bracing himself against something heavy. "Do you want to talk about something?" Michael asked, his voice gentle, not pressing. Lucas sighed, his head slightly lowered. "I don't know, it's just that I feel safer here." That simple sentence made Michael's heart clench. His son, the child he had always thought was strong and independent, felt so safe when he was with him. Thinking about how Lucas had had to hide these feelings for so many years, he couldn't help but feel heartbroken. Michael gently placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "There's nothing wrong with feeling that way, Lucas. Everyone needs a place to feel safe." Lucas nodded slightly but didn't say anything else. After a while, he gently lay down, still keeping his distance from Michael, but without the reserve he had before. Michael also lay down, letting the moonlight outside the window cast faint streaks of light onto the ceiling. In the darkness, Lucas suddenly spoke, his voice so small it was almost swallowed by the silent space. "Dad, have you ever felt like you don't belong anywhere?" Michael was surprised by the question, but he didn't rush to answer. He considered each word before replying. "I think everyone feels that way sometimes, son, but the important thing is not where you belong right now, but that you don't have to face that feeling alone." Lucas was silent, as if pondering his father's answer. After a while, he breathed out very softly, as if the burden on his shoulders had lightened somewhat. Thanks, Dad. Michael smiled in the darkness. I'll always be here, Lucas, whenever you need me. No more words were spoken, but the atmosphere in the room had changed. Michael could feel Lucas's breathing gradually becoming more even, the tension on his face also easing. The feeling of distance between them over the past few days had now been replaced by a deeper connection. For the first time in days, Michael closed his eyes with a bit of relief. He knew that the journey ahead was still long, but at least they had found an important step: understanding, safety, and a place for Lucas to feel like he wasn't alone anymore. After those long, silent nights together, the relationship between Michael and Lucas had undergone a subtle but profound change. Michael could sense that his son was gradually opening up, but there was still something he couldn't say. A part of him worried that Lucas was hiding a greater pain than he imagined. One evening after dinner, as Michael was clearing the table, Lucas suddenly appeared in the kitchen doorway. He stood there, his hand clenching the hem of his shirt, his eyes hesitant. "Are you free, Dad?" Lucas asked, his voice soft but with a hint of urgency. Michael put down the dish towel, turned around, and smiled. "Of course, son. What's wrong?" Lucas didn't answer immediately, but instead stepped into the living room and sat down on the sofa. Michael followed, sitting down beside him, keeping enough distance so that his son didn't feel pressured. Silence enveloped the space. Lucas looked down at his hands, his fingers tightly intertwined, as if fighting an internal battle. Michael didn't urge him on. He knew his son needed time. Finally, after a long, seemingly endless silence, Lucas took a deep breath, then said, his voice trembling slightly, "Have you ever felt like there's a part of yourself that you can't tell anyone about?" Michael was startled by that question, but he remained calm. He looked at Lucas, seeing his eyes full of anxiety and expectation. "I think everyone has parts of themselves that they're not ready to share," Michael replied, his voice warm, "but I also believe that when you find someone you trust, you can share without fear." Lucas clasped his hands together tightly. I feel lost. Not just in the family, but also with myself. I don't know what to do with that." Michael felt his heart clench. He had guessed that Lucas was struggling internally, but hearing his son say it made him feel it more clearly than ever before. "You don't have to find all the answers right now, Lucas," Michael said, his voice gentle. "The important thing is that you don't have to go through this alone." Lucas looked up, his eyes shining with a glimmer of hope. "Really?" Michael smiled, putting a hand on his son's shoulder. "I'm always here. I'm not going anywhere." Lucas didn't say anything, but he nodded slightly, as if those words had helped him feel relieved somewhat. After a moment of silence, Michael decided to ask a question that he had been thinking about for a long time. "Have you ever thought about talking to someone else? Someone who can help you understand more about what you're feeling?" Lucas bit his lip, his eyes full of thought. "You mean, a therapist?" Michael nodded. "That's right. There's nothing wrong with seeking help, son. Sometimes, just having someone listen without judgment can help us feel better." Lucas was silent for a long time. Then he exhaled softly. "I don't know, but maybe I'll try." Michael felt a wave of relief wash over him. This wasn't an immediate solution, but it was a step forward. "I'm very proud of you, Lucas," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "I know this isn't easy, but you're gradually finding your way." Lucas looked at his father, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled a genuine smile. No longer forced. "Thank you for not abandoning me." Michael felt his eyes sting, but he just gently squeezed his son's hand. "I'll never do that, son. Never." On the day Lucas decided to schedule an appointment with a psychologist, Michael felt a mixture of anxiety and pride. He couldn't remember the last time his son had actively made such an important decision. But today, right before his eyes, Lucas was holding his phone, hesitating a moment before pressing the send button on the confirmation email. After hitting send, Lucas put the phone down on the table and took a long breath. He looked down at his hands, fidgeting with his sweater, a habit he often did when he was stressed. Michael silently sat beside him, not urging him on, not intruding on his son's thoughts. "I don't know if this will help," Lucas mumbled, his eyes absent-mindedly looking out the window. Michael gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes, just starting is important enough. You've done that. Lucas nodded slightly, but he still saw the anxiety lurking in his son's eyes. On the first day Lucas went to the consultation, Michael drove him to the center of the university. Along the way, he didn't say much, just looked out the window, his face reflecting the dim light of the late afternoon. When the car stopped, he gripped the strap of his backpack for a long time before opening the door and getting out. Michael watched his son, his heart aching with an indescribable feeling. He wanted to say something strong, something encouraging, but he could only utter a simple sentence, "I'll wait for you here." Lucas turned to look at him, his eyes a little surprised. Then he nodded slightly before entering the building. Michael sat quietly in the car, his heart filled with emotion. He wasn't sure what he was worried about. Would Lucas feel comfortable talking to a stranger? Would he feel relieved after the meeting? Or would everything continue to be a maze of contradictions in his son's heart? About 50 minutes later, the building door opened and Lucas came out. He didn't look too different. But when he got into the car, Michael noticed a very slight change. His shoulders seemed less tense. "How did it go, son?" Michael asked, keeping his tone gentle so as not to create pressure. Lucas was silent for a few seconds, as if choosing his words. "Not bad," he said, his eyes still looking straight ahead. "It was a little weird at first. But then, I felt a little lighter." Michael smiled. "That's good. You don't have to rush. Just keep going in the way that you feel best about it." Lucas didn't answer immediately, but he saw the corner of his lips slightly lift into a fleeting smile. In the weeks that followed, Michael began to notice slow but clear changes in Lucas. He gradually became more open in conversations. Family meals were no longer just silent moments. Lucas began to ask about his parents' day, sometimes even taking the initiative to tell them about what he was experiencing at school. One evening, when the two men were watching a movie, Lucas suddenly spoke. "Dad, what do you think if I tried to share more with Mom too?" Michael turned to look at his son, a little surprised but full of hope. "I think that's a good idea. Mom cares about you very much, and she'd be very happy if you wanted to share." Lucas nodded, his eyes shining with a certainty that Michael had never seen before. That night, Michael sat alone on the sofa after Lucas had gone to bed, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. This journey wasn't over, and there would be many challenges ahead. But at least, for the first time in a long time, he could believe that his son was on the path to finding himself, and more importantly, Lucas knew that he didn't have to go alone. As time went on, the changes in Lucas became more and more apparent. He no longer holed himself up in his room all day. Instead, he actively spent time with his family, occasionally helping Michael fix things around the house or cooking with his mother. Conversations between the two men became more natural, without the awkward silences as before. One Sunday morning, as Michael was making coffee, Lucas walked into the kitchen, pulling a chair out to sit down across from him. He was silent for a moment before saying softly, "You know what, Dad? I think I finally realized that I don't need to have all the answers right away." Michael stopped what he was doing, looking at his son with a gentle smile. "That's an important thing to realize, Lucas, and I'm very proud that you've reached this point." Lucas chuckled slightly, his eyes no longer as sad as before. "I just wanted to say thank you for not abandoning me, for being there for me when I needed you." Michael felt his throat tighten. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, squeezing lightly as a confirmation. "I'll always be here, Lucas, no matter where you go, what you do, you'll never have to be alone." That morning, as the family had breakfast together, laughter and lively conversation rang out in the house again. Michael looked at Lucas, knowing that the journey ahead was still long, but he was no longer alone. And that, for him, was everything.